Hi everyone and welcome back to Upfront with Jane. I'm delighted to be joined by Kenda Macdonald today. Kenda's skill set is combining biopsychology insights with marketing automation. She also uses her knowledge to help create automation journeys that help get better quality leads, higher conversions, and ultimately happy customers that spend more. As well as being CEO of Automation Ninja, she's also a keynote speaker, which is where our paths crossed. We recently spotted Kenda talking at Marketing Meetup. Kenda was born and raised in South Africa, and she now lives in the south of England with her husband, Mike, and 3 cats. So there's an intro for you. A little bit of an overview of everything. Welcome on board, Kenda. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
No cats in shot at the moment.
No, you might have one yowling at the door in a second.
Oh,
but,
good.
Yeah, not right now.
So I studied psychology, but I'd imagine there's a lot that I don't know, and I'm hoping to learn a lot from you today, as will many people that are listening. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about how you got into combining psychology and marketing, where it all started.
It's a crazy story, but effectively I originally came to the UK. I was offered a job placement in the British Police Force because I was studying forensic psychology. And so that's how I originally got into the psychology angle. And because I was an international student, I was kind of paying my way through university, doing lots of odd jobs, as you do when you're a student. Yeah. And one of those jobs was working in a marketing automation company as a PA. And I very quickly sort of picked up a lot of the marketing automation bits and bobs. And within about 6 months, I was operations manager at that company, and sort of just climbed my way through the ranks. And it was just a happy coincidence of time, really, because I was doing my neuroscience module at that point in time. Neuroscience is one of the specialisms that I did. And it was just really clear that the stuff that we were creating in that agency that I was working for just was not catered for how the brain actually works and makes decisions and how we pay attention to things. And that sort of got me off on a totally different tangent to what I expected to be on. And I ended up, after sort of trying to get the agency that I was working in at that time to adapt and take on some of these things, and they weren't really interested. They weren't interested in experimenting. Some agencies aren't, and that's fine. But I ended up, when that agency sort of started to go downhill, starting my own company and just saying, let's see if we can do it. Let's see if we can take those insights and apply them to marketing, help people understand the brain a little bit better and how we actually make purchase decisions and how we pay attention and all those little important things that we don't necessarily always know in marketing. So bringing that forward, helping people make better marketing as a result.
So for people listening, can you sort of put it into context? So you mentioned that people weren't responding well to some of the content that was going out there. In what respects? Is that down to the copy, the way it's, how can you put that into context a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the biggest issues that happens is that people are targeting people at the wrong point in their consumption journey. Okay. And I think everyone's kind of aware of the awareness, consideration, decision kind of model that people tend to roll out for the buyer's journey, so to speak. But there's actually a lot more that goes into that. Awareness has 5 stages to it that people go through. So if we leave aside that model that people, very often adopt because it's a very simple and straightforward model, awareness has 5 stages before someone gets to the point of purchase. And as we transition through each of those 5 stages, what is interesting to us as a consumer, and that could be in B2B or B2C, someone who is consuming a product or a service is a consumer. So when you're going through those stages, useful information is different in each one of those stages. When you understand that, you understand that the brain is looking for very specific information in each stage. And what a lot of people tend to do is they tend to put marketing out there, whether it's content or ads or you name it, whatever we're putting out there, really mismatched to the stage that someone is in their consumption journey. And that means that a lot of the content or the stuff that gets put out on social, a lot of that advertising material just gets filtered out by the brain, doesn't even get paid attention to. So you kind of end up shouting to the void a lot of the time. So when you take a step back and you go, okay, these are the stages my consumers are going through, this is what is useful and interesting to them and they want to know at each stage, you can craft your materials to be very, very targeted instead, and focus on the stages that you know you're going to be helpful in. And that helps you create much better relationships and also get that attention in the first place instead of just sort of shouting into the void. So that's just like one thing. It's a fundamental shift in understanding how people want to consume information versus how we think they want to consume information and what we put out as a result.
And what would you say the 5 stages are? Would you say they're the same if you're in a B2B market, B2C? Would you say people go through the same 5 stages?
100%, yes. They just go through them differently.
Okay.
So in terms of B2B in general is super protracted. Like the stages are really obvious, they're really clear because of the fact that people spend so much longer in them, and there are so many more decision makers at each point, right? So you're not just like convincing one person, you're convincing them and their team, or them and their bosses, and whatever the case is, people spend a lot of time in those chunks. So it's not uncommon to see a B2B decision process anywhere from like 3 months to 18 months on average, you know. So it's a hell of a long cycle compared to consumers who will sometimes make a decision within a day, within a few hours, within a few minutes, and they can very rapidly go through that cycle, whereas businesses and the decision makers behind it take a lot longer. So B2B is kind of in a way a little bit more fun. I know that's like not what you tend to hear about B2B marketing, but it's more fun from a behavioral element because there's so much more content that is consumed. And so you get to spend a lot more time learning about that person and progressively profiling and sort of figuring out where they are and helping them through the journey. Whereas with B2C, it's so rapid, it happens quickly. I guess if you're into quick wins, then B2C is a little bit more fun, but I enjoy B2B for the nerdy factor.
Definitely. And I think a lot of the time what we see being predominantly in a B2B area is that actually, I think sometimes people think that the personality is not as important in B2B, whereas we try and argue that it's even more important.
Yeah, because you've got to keep attention for so much longer.
Yeah.
You have to
make that point of difference. You know, I mean, you haven't taught me through your stages yet, but the initial stage is discovery, I guess, isn't it? Finding out what it is, why there's a gap, why they need it. And once they've established that, they may have learned that from you, but it's keeping them loyal. So they want to progress to the next stage with you on the next one and the one after that. So how would you define the 5 stages?
So everyone starts off. So these stages, by the way, were the stages that I'm going to talk about now are Eugene Schwartz's stages. So he wrote a book in the 1970s called Breakthrough Advertising, which is a fantastic book, very advertising based. But what he kind of proposed was that we had these different stages that we paid, that advertising was different and should be different at each of the stages. I don't think he realized at that time that what he was doing was he was pretty much perfectly mapping the general learning process. So the process the brain goes through in order to encode information and recall that information, which is, of course, if we can't encode it or recall it, we can't make a decision on it. So really important for that learning process. So now that we have a little bit more neuroscience and psychology behind us, you know, we can basically take a lot of the principles in marketing that have worked for a very long time and go, oh, that's why it works, which is pretty much exactly what happened. So I like to use Eugene Schwartz's awareness stages over the general learning process, just because the general learning process is a little bit boring, it's a little bit dry, and Eugene Schwartz's ones are super easy to sort of interact with and split up, a little bit more marketing fun. So I utilize those stages, but there's 5 stages. Everyone starts off unaware that they have a problem or an issue. And in that unaware phase, we may have symptoms of a problem. So we might think that we have a certain problem, but as the expert, you will know that your consumers don't actually have that issue. They'll have symptoms of the issue, but they're unaware that it is part of a larger problem. Then there is a catalyst. Something happens and we become problem aware. And when we become problem aware, this is our first massive research point. So this is the point that we turn to the internet for help. So this is, Google calls this the 0 moment of truth, the point at which we start searching for stuff or looking outside of our own information sources for information to help us understand what our challenge is. So huge research opportunity. That's where the keyword research happens for the most part. As we learn more about our problem and understand the width and breadth of our problem, we then become solution aware. And solution aware is where we start to look for ways we can solve that problem. So it's a marked change in behavior from wanting to understand what the issue is to wanting to understand how to solve the issue. And so the information that's important to us is different. And what's valuable to us is different as a result. So we want to then learn about everything that could help us solve the problem. But importantly, we're not looking to buy a product or a service here. We're looking to understand the marketplace, understand the options that are available to us. And as we learn more about those, we start to create criteria and we start to become aware of options that suit us more than other options. And that change and looking at individual options is when we become product aware. So we become aware that there are specific products and specific options that could help us. And those specific products and specific options, we start to then build criteria around and suss them out and sort of compare and contrast them to one another. And as we then learn more about those individual options, we then become most aware, we start becoming interested in the people behind those options and the companies behind it and how we can then buy it. And that is when that's most aware, and that's when we reach out to sales. So that's the point at which we sort of start really interacting with the company to buy. And as we go through each of those 5 stages, what is valuable to us changes significantly. The type of information that they're interested in changes significantly, and the behavior changes significantly, which allows us to track them through the stages and also allows us to always make sure that we're preempting that next step. So those are our five stages of awareness effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. No, really interesting. And I guess you talked about B2C, so you could identify a problem and potentially go and buy something within a day, couldn't you, I suppose? Exactly.
So in B2C, it's very fast. People will transition through the stages, but we'll still like spend specific points in specific places where we're trying to understand, what's the best option in the marketplace? What are the reviews like? I like comparing and contrasting things, taking a look at, especially nowadays, the ethical relations of a company or whatever the case is. We have our specific research points within those. And it's still up to B2C companies to be focusing on making sure that you are providing that information at each step along the way. And you're making it really clear for people that all that information is signposted. You just might not have individual lead magnets and individual pieces of content in the same way that you would for B2B, because in B2B, people could be in each of those stages for weeks and months. Yeah. And so you might need a lot of content around each of those stages, whereas sometimes in B2C, it could all be on the same page.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there's definitely, it leads on to lots of things, doesn't it? Like looking into reviews, looking into comparisons, how supportive they are, customer service. This all forms part of that research phase, doesn't it? And that kind of building up that relationship before you make that purchase.
100%. 100%.
Then once you've committed, which customers would you say are more loyal? The B2B or the B2C? Or is that down to is that down to the psychology of how you continue to communicate with them?
Yes. 100%. Yeah, it's definitely down to the quality of your onboarding process and how seriously you take your customer lifetime value.
Yeah.
So if you're going to take that seriously, then you're going to get really good quality customers for the long run. But yeah, it really, and also depends on the type of product that you're selling. There are B2B companies out there who can only ever sell one thing, so it depends, which is a rubbish answer.
Yeah, no, it's very true. Maybe a rubbish question. So when you got into psychology, you weren't necessarily thinking about marketing, am I right? So bring me back to the start then. At what age and what was your first kind of taste of thinking that psychology was something for you?
Oh, so this would have been when I was an early teenager. Unfortunately, one of my friends from South Africa, and one of my friends was murdered in a not very nice way at all. And I just decided that I was going to dedicate my life to putting bad people away. And that was the thing that I was going to do. So I decided that forensic psychology or forensic pathology was the original one for me. And then as I kind of learned more about it, I realized that I was a little bit more interested in how the brain worked than how the body worked. But I was still all the way through high school and all the way up into university, kind of umming and ahhing on whether it was medicine or psychology. It was really hard to decide between the two. But yeah, I did a little bit of job shadowing in Cape Town morgue, and spent some time sort of really getting into into the forensics world, and that was really where I wanted to go. And then when I kind of looked at other things, you have to make that choice when I think you're working in any kind of forensics, or especially in criminal profiling, where, let's be honest, what you're going to be spending most of your day doing is profiling and figuring out whether or not someone is going to be a repeat sex offender or something like that. It's not the glamorous job that you see in all the programs. You have to make a choice whether or not you're okay with spending the rest of your life doing that, like seeing the real dark side of society. And I sort of had an opportunity where I was like, what if we could make companies better instead, and they could have a positive effect on the world? And this is like super, like, this is, not naivety, but desiring for that positive change in the front. What if instead we could have a positive effect on the front end of it, instead of trying to pick up the broken pieces who are already broken on the back end of it? What if we could do that instead? And so I made a choice. And I wanted to do something that I found really intellectually stimulating, rather than something that was kind of plodding through stuff on a day-to-day basis. So
No, fascinating. Do you find when you meet people and tell them what you do, they start thinking that you're sussing them out?
Oh, 100%. It's so funny when people are like, especially people who know a little bit about it, and they're like, what type of, because like forensic psychology is an umbrella term, so it actually kind of encompasses quite a lot. It encompasses anything to do with psychology in the criminal justice system, which is huge. But criminal profiling was the path that I was going down. That was what I was sort of choosing to specialize in, and people get really uncomfortable when they realize that they're profiling me now.
It's probably quite a good judge of character, isn't it? If people get really nervous in your company, then start to wonder why. I know everything about you. One of the things I've heard you talking about as well is how people develop a certain set of biases that they rely on when they're making decisions. Is that something you could talk to me a bit more about? I was interested in that. What does that mean? How does that affect people, and how does that tend to work?
Yeah, for sure. So we have two different ways that we take information in the world around us, and that we utilize to pay attention to stuff and how to make decisions. And because of the way that one of these systems works, we make a lot of errors. And we have a lot of corruptions in the way that we take that information in. So we're taking around 11 million bits of information with one of these systems. And that system can only take in so much information because it uses lots of rules and mental shortcuts to understand how to deal with all that information. As it takes that information in, it's bound to make mistakes. And what's really interesting is that it makes repeatable mistakes with the way that we take information in through attention, and then we make decisions based on stuff. And those repeatable mistakes that we've been able to identify through fMRI scans and a lot of experiments in psychology have led us to cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are repeatable corruptions in the decision-making process. And these little biases make us do all sorts of weird things as consumers, but basically at the end of the day, it means we don't make good, logical and sound decisions at all. The brain did not evolve to buy things online. It didn't evolve to make decisions about which mortgage company you want to go with. Like, that is not what we evolved to do. We evolved to be in the forest, hear that all the birds have stopped making a noise, and realize that there is a predator close by. Like, that's the kind of level that we evolved to, and we've just pushed it way past what it was originally intended for. So we make all these like weird logical things. And that means that when people are looking at our products and our services as businesses, they're not making a super logical, straightforward decision. The brain, number one, is going to be doing everything that it can to save calories. That's the thing that it wants to do. It wants to save calories. It doesn't want to use calories, because if it saves calories, it increases your chances of surviving to the next day. So it's still a survival machine, right? So it's going to not do things that are too taxing. So it will swap out It'll do things like hill climbing, which is where it will swap out one goal for another goal. So let's say you're taking a look at your mortgage applications and you're deciding between two different mortgage companies. Chances are you're not going to make a decision based on, you know, the numbers that are being presented to you, but you're probably going to make a decision based on the branding of the company, or how nice that sales rep was, or something else that was given to you, you know. So a lot of the time the brain switches out these little goals for an easier goal, one that's not so taxing, one that we don't have to pay so much attention to, and one that we won't use so many calories on. And unfortunately, as businesses, we tend to think that our brain is very logical, and we tend to create marketing materials and information that are very logical and take people through it step by step. And we forget that the brain is a survival machine, and we don't know that it's making all these errors. So a lot of the time we have over 300 biases that have been identified so far, a good 120 of them that have got, you know, really good peer reviewing behind them as well, and repeatable studies, lots and lots of repeatable studies. And we have good fMRI evidence for a lot of them, so a lot of neuroscience evidence for a lot of them now, as well as, you know, fMRI scanners are becoming more prevalent in universities. And it's really impossible for us as businesses to try and cater for all of these biases. Instead, what we should be doing is understanding that there are specific times in which the brain is going to have difficulty in making a logical decision, and we should be helping people make more conscious and considered decisions instead. If we can just change that a little bit, the brain will retain the information that we want it to retain. We get a more logical decision out, and people will not make silly mistakes. Because it does make a hell of a lot of silly mistakes.
But I suppose that goes back to a lot of the things that you touched on there, go back to just making people's lives easier. So if, for example, if they are buying online and it's 5 clicks opposed to 2, that is things as a marketer that you're constantly working on, because we've all been there. We just want something to work. I don't want to have to fill out a form. I just want the information to be there, or I don't want to pick up the phone when you give me an option of live chat. So I think, again, it's trying to provide as many forms of communication as possible. I think one of the things we certainly notice with delving a bit into the psychology of when we onboard a business is we definitely get different types of clients. So you might have the more detailed person, you might be dealing more with the entrepreneurial character who wants the purchase that's going to make them look good, who, I love your brand, I think I'd like to be aligned with you, or the detailed person who wants to know every single piece of information in your T's and C's. And there's the more cautious person who wants to know that they're making the safest choice. Do you think there's work to be done there that people can tailor to really better understand the different types of, even down to position or decision makers that they're liaising with, and start profiling in that respect?
100%. Understanding the sort of the psychographics. So psychographics are the you get your demographics and your psychographics, and your demographics are your things that you use to divide up the population statistically. So like age, gender, that kind of stuff. It's very it's very statistical information that you utilize to understand groupings of people. But then you get your psychographics, and your psychographics are the human elements, of the things that are driving people, the psychology behind it. So things like, you know, what goals is that person striving to achieve? What are their values? What are their attitudes and their opinions about certain things? When you start to kind of look at that for each of your groupings, and you start to group people by different things, you get clear on what's really important to people. And what's really important to people is a significant driver in the decision-making process. So when you can understand how to highlight and contrast those things and make that information easily available to them, you help them make decisions. And I'm really big on not utilizing bias as a conversion opportunity. So you'll see a lot of sort of pop psychology that talks about doing things like changing the placement of how you lay out your pricing table to affect conversion rates. We have to remember that's one cognitive bias. We don't know how all of the other cognitive biases that are going to be prevalent at that time are going to be affecting that. And they all cascade off one another and get involved with one another. So it's really hard to take one bias and just go, I'm going to focus on that. Yeah. So what I tend to say to people instead is understand what's important to your audience, which is exactly why, just as you say, doing those persona activities and separating your audience out and profiling them based on those things. and then understand how to highlight the important information for them to make it easier for them. It's all about providing context and making it easier for people to make a decision that they would make if we could take that bias out of the way. So we're trying to help them make a more logical decision by flagging up the information that's important to them, and take some of that bias out. Because if you have too much bias in a decision, and someone makes a decision that they wouldn't have necessarily made themselves given perfect conditions, we get buyer's remorse. Buyer's remorse is not good for your customer lifetime value or a happy customer. So yeah.
And it's got to be a two-way thing. I mean, it obviously depends on the business and what type of services you're selling, whether it's a quick sale or if it's a long-term business that you're looking for. It's very much got to come down to the values. Do they align? Do they actually know what they're buying into? If you're wanting that to work, then it's got to be a two-way thing. I know when we onboard clients, it's very much about, is this client, do we feel that it's the right fit for us? Do we honestly think we're the right provide support for them? Are we going to be the great best partners for them? Because like I say, otherwise that very quickly deteriorates and it's not on the same page. You know, it can sometimes, a sale can be the easy bit, but actually if they're not in full information about what they're buying into, then it's not going to work long term.
No, definitely not. No.
Fascinating. So so you've written a book as well, haven't you?
Yes. I have a bestseller, which is always exciting to be able to say that, called Hack the Buyer Brain, and that's all about how we evolved to survive and not to buy stuff online. And it kind of takes people through the different stages of life cycle marketing and helps people understand the psychology behind those stages, and what's going on in the brain at that point, with some practical examples, some things that you can go off and do for your marketing automation. So
where can people make a good online buying decision and buy your book?
You can get it on Amazon. It's on Amazon, and you can get it on our website as well. It's just automationninjas.com, and there's a little tab for the book there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what type of clients, what type of businesses are you working with? Is it a range?
It is a range, and that's because variety is the spice of life for me. So yeah, I love the variety. We have B2C, we have B2B, we've even had B2G, so business to government, which is always an interesting cookie. So yeah, I enjoy that range and I enjoy that variety, but most of the businesses, because of that, I've crafted specific things in the business for different size businesses. So we have an academy for smaller businesses where businesses who couldn't maybe afford our consultancy services can learn everything that they need to learn how to do it themselves, and also for those businesses who just want to do it themselves. So that's kind of like a DIY thing. There's tons of recordings and stuff, and we do monthly challenges for stuff. So we have the academy, and then we have our consultancy services, and the businesses that are interested in that are, you know, generally slightly larger businesses with a marketing team and marketing budgets that are really kind of working hard on their marketing automation. So we have offerings at different levels for different people. I like that variety.
Fantastic. So are you constantly yourself, do you find that you're constantly reading? Where does your learning come from? Where do you stay abreast of things and get your own learnings from? Because everything is changing, and I know a lot of it will be hands-on experience, but where do you go for your kind of constant education, if you like?
So I'm a journal fiend. I like to read psychology papers. So I spend a lot of my time in various different applied journals, applied psychology, and etc. Just having a look at various different places and various different things that are coming out. I also like to keep an eye on some of the psychology textbooks, because obviously I like to torture myself, because they're never easy to read, but I do find them really interesting. I've got a couple here actually. There's one that came out relatively recently. Well, the second edition of it came out, and that was a lot of people know Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and the kind of secondary version of that, it's all the way over there. So that's called Heuristics and Biases, and there's a second version of, it's basically taking all of the original research from Thinking Fast and Slow and leveling it up, and it's like a collation of a whole bunch of different papers across different biases and different subsections, which is really cool. So I really like that. yeah, I tend to read a lot of psychology textbooks.
I can imagine. And do you find that you revisit them and read them in a different way next time?
Oh yeah, 100%. I was actually reading, I've gone back to Thinking Fast and Slow because I'm busy writing a book on cognitive biases at the moment. So there's a lot of cognitive bias specific research happening. And I'm rereading Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's really interesting compared to the first few times that I read it, how I'm now reading it and taking totally different things away, which I really enjoy. I enjoy that.
It's a bit like coaching, isn't it? I think sometimes in coaching you go over the same things again and again, but you need to actually make it slot in. And first time you hear it, it touches part of the brain. The next time, once you've started acting on it, you think, oh, I sort of get what that means now. And then it just gives you that confidence, doesn't it? To know that, yes, this makes sense to me now. I'm progressing.
Yeah, exactly. So I do like, I mean, I won't say I like it because I have ADHD. So doing things over and over again is not my cup of tea.
No.
this is why I have a team who do the repetitive things.
Yes.
Because they will do it better than I will, because I will get annoyed with it and I will abandon it halfway through. But it's different when I feel like you have different context, and you can take different meaning out. It then becomes an intellectual exercise, and I like those. So yeah, for sure.
So what is your behavior like online then when you're buying? Do you analyze every single purchase you make, or do you fall into every bias?
I pretty much fall into every bias. I was actually laughing at myself. And the worst thing is, you know you're doing it, but you do it. And it's like when I go out and I buy things, I'm just such a branding whore. I look at branding and I'm like, oh, that's so pretty.
We all are though, and that's great for our industry, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's so beautiful. What a great set of emails that I just received. And then I end up buying because the marketing was so good, and I know it's good, and I know exactly what they're doing, but I buy it anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, so, right. I know. I'm renovating a house at the moment, and I'd rather pay 3 times more for something because I know it'll be delivered when they've said. If there's any issues, I can get on the phone and I know they'll sort it out. And your time is money, isn't it? So I think for me that's a good decision.
No, I feel you. No, I'm a terrible consumer.
Well, it's all market research, isn't it? You're just putting yourself out there to test it. That's how I use it.
I actually have like a whole slide deck where it's like breaking down an example of me going through the awareness stages and how bad the marketing was at each stage, and how stuff just wasn't catered. Like companies clearly hadn't thought about it, and it was for buying some running clothing. And it still makes me laugh every time I look at it, and I should probably do it for some other examples as well.
Yeah, no, it'd be really interesting.
But yeah, it's fascinating when you actually do start breaking things down. I'm terrible for screenshotting the process.
Yeah, because you're in it then. You're not thinking about it. You're too excited. You're in the process. It's like salespeople. They always say, don't they? You can sell anything to a salesperson, even though they know the techniques. They're still totally bought into it when it's somebody else. Same thing, I'd imagine. So thank you. That's been fascinating. I've loved every minute of hearing all this. I feel like I've learned a lot from speaking to you today, and I think a lot of people will take a lot away from it. For anyone who's listening and wants to find out where they can follow you, I know we've touched on your book, but what's the best ways to communicate with you, to follow you, to find you, connect, etc.?
LinkedIn's always pretty good. So it's just Kenda Macdonald on LinkedIn. And then Twitter is also a great place. It's just _ Kenda Macdonald. And then just on the website, it's just automationninjas.com. I've got a blog up there that talks about all this kind of stuff. So feel free to go and poke around. There's lots of freebies on there.
Thank you very much. And not a cat in sight. They've been very well behaved.
Been very well. I think it's because it's sunny. I think they're lying in the sun somewhere.
They're online shopping.
Yeah.
Oh, no, really appreciate you joining me. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks.